Welcome to The Collective, where every conversation ignites a new perspective. Join us as we delve into the journeys of remarkable individuals, explore the art of growth, resilience, and the power of a shared mission. This is your gateway to insights and inspiration as we strive to be better together. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to The Collective. We have another fantastic show for you planned out today. Apologies for getting this a little bit late start. We're going to blame Sean on this one completely. It's totally his fault.
Totally this guy.
But I am looking forward to this conversation now. While I am looking forward to it, make sure you are looking forward to it. Do all the things like the show, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, do all that good stuff. Get your emails when we go live, which of course Fridays for The Collective and Wednesdays for the Gold Mine. We got Chris rejoining us. We got Brian rejoining us. I am stoked. Let's get some intros out of the way, and then we can dive right into the convo. Chris, 10 to 15 seconds. Who are you? Where you come from? All that good stuff.
Yeah, hi, I'm Chris Frueh. I'm a clinical psychologist at the University of Hawaii. Most of my work this past decade has been with first responders and special operators. Wrote a book titled Operator Syndrome recently.
Bam. And it is a very important subject that I think anybody that has been in the military, especially throughout the GWAT, has definitely should read and get in on that because it's important stuff. Brian, how about yourself? 10 to 50 seconds. Give her.
Retired homicide lieutenant, worked mostly gangs and homicide work for most of my career in the South in a very large city, local police department, and still do gang training and run 2 podcasts. The Disruptors with Brian Sanders. It's more variety. I interview gang members, former Nazi skinheads, musicians, runs the whole gamut. And then also a true crime podcast with my wife as a host. And it's called Night Shift with Andrea Uplake.
Bam. And you guys just got married, right? Just recently last year?
Yeah.
Congratulations, dude. That's fantastic.
Like I say, that's why I'm always smiling, dude.
There you go. It's good to be smiling the first year, that's for sure. Sean, how's the mountains treating you?
Yeah, things are good out here. I just wanted to give a shout out to Chris because, his book is important when it comes to folks who've been in the game, but it's also important as a entry point into conversations. As an example, we've got some guests staying at our house that just arrived yesterday. And my wife said, well, who are the guests on the show? And so I loosely described them. But then I got to segue into the topic of, you should consider reading Chris's book, and here's why. And these folks have got nothing to do with the military or serving in that sense. They're standard issue folks, but they face the same kind of stressors as most people do. And so I think the book crosses through a number of different industries and ways to approach life. I just think it's a good point of conversation for the normies, I suppose.
Thank you for saying that. Well, and just to throw that back at you, my work and my focus is with soldiers and law enforcement, firefighters, but I guess you could extract one of the perspectives from my book is that when we talk about mental health, mental illness, we talk about it as though it's this mystical thing that's just in your head. What I've been trying to say, and I think more and more people are coming around to, is that mental illness involves physiological aspects. And so physiological treatments, and there's a lot of them now that we are not really using, need to be kind of brought more to the forefront. So and that includes diet and exercise and sleep, and maybe it's the most important thing than any of us could be doing well for ourselves can make such a difference.
Those are the big low-hanging fruit ones too, right? Like if you just exercise and you get some good sleep and you're eating well, that'll take care of a good portion of a lot of issues. And I think
absolutely, except that it's not low-hanging fruit because most people have really struggled to do these things. But it's low-hanging fruit, and that it's easy to identify what needs to be done.
There you go. That's a good start to it. And I think that just showed off my implicit bias, just looking right at it. So let's get into the conversation. We're going to be talking bias today. So I want to get your guys' thoughts right off the bat. When you saw the email, when you heard me say that this was the topic, what were your first thoughts right off the bat? Sean, I'm going to start with you this time, as I don't think I've ever started with you before.
Yeah, sure. So I did cheat a little bit. So while I was dealing with blue screens of death on my brand spanking new laptop, I had my other laptop on the go with ChatGPT and Claude 3.5 Sonnet. And I created a, not quite a master list, but I created a 10-point list of different biases that we could jump into. And generally speaking, what I challenged the robots to do was think outside of the box. So there's tons of different ways that we could slice up biases, but I went about it through let's talk about some uncommon things that isn't often considered on the subject of biases. So I don't want to jump into my list because it'll take us in a bonkers direction, like 10 different bonkers directions. I don't really want to derail the show with too much out of the box thinking right from the get-go. So I'm gonna lob a softball and say, I'm gonna pass the microphone on.
Bam. What about Chris? How about yourself?
So what came to my mind, first of all, and I think just to introduce this as a scientist, in science, we talk about the concern of experimenter bias. And so what that means is we do a whole lot of things when we're doing research to pull the investigator, the researchers out of being able to for their bias to influence the studies. And we do that as much as we can. But one point is we have to try to be aware of our biases, and usually that's our interests. If I have a hypothesis about something, right there's a bias. I hypothesize that physiology should be forward. It's not really a hypothesis, but that's a perspective that I have. And as I go out to test that, I have to develop my studies so that I'm not short of getting what I'm looking for. If that makes sense.
Yeah, interesting.
So that's why we do double-blind studies where the investigators themselves don't know which medication or which treatment the subject is going to get. That's why we have other people, not ourselves. We have research staff who handle the data and touch the data. I don't even have access to my own data frequently or direct access to it. So we do all these things to kind of protect our research from being vulnerable to our own biases. And some of that I think is useful to think about in every other setting in life. How do we go about identifying and mitigating the effects of our biases on anything?
I think that's a fantastic question to dive into. Brian, you got any thoughts?
Yeah, I come from a field in police work where the buzzword was implicit bias for, the last few years. And the first thing we were told when we were going to take this training, and my department had one of the, longest hours of completion for this training for the entire department. But we were told that police officers were the ones who needed this training the most because they had implicit biases, right? Or that they were already prone to racism, for some people would say that, which to me was absolutely bonkers. It didn't make any sense because even in day one in the police academy, we were talking about, and this is decades ago, about your own conceived ideas of people or areas. And a lot of the running jokes were that we were a large city in the South. You can hear how I talk, and people assume right off the bat I'm an idiot. I might agree with some people, but because I speak with a Southern accent, that I'm somehow uneducated or ignorant. And even in class, you could see people who had moved down from New York, Boston area, New Jersey, Massachusetts, to be cops in our city because they had their own problems up there with hiring. And then within class, understanding you already are going to have the public can have a bias against you when you get out on the street and you're talking in a very strong Long Island accent, and you're talking to someone who was born and raised in the South and their parents and grandparents and that sort of thing. But when I went through the training, it to me, it did not make a lot of sense for us as police officers, because one of the things that they were trying to, I guess, bring to our attention is that when we see someone, not to judge them and this sort of thing based on pigment or their clothing. And we had to say time and time again in the training, we don't do that. we're assessing people on their human behavior, their actions. Are their fists balled up? Are they blading their body? Are they tapping their waistband? What are their eyes doing? Are their eyes darting to where we know there's a known area or a cut that they may, flee to? That's what we're paying attention to in police work. We're not getting hung up on pigment or these racial categories that society has. Like, we're just dealing with right off the bat, is this a threat or not? And how does our brain move so quickly to articulate threat? Oh, this is how, and it reads body language. So the whole buzzword around implicit bias didn't make sense to me in that context. I mean, it was kind of like common sense. We all knew, yeah, hey, look, if I'm dealing with someone on the street and the first thing they tell me is they were in the Marine Corps, and I flash back to today's being in the Army and butting heads with a Marine or something, I may right off the bat go, oh, I had a bad experience with a Marine. But then I can think about my cousin and other people who've served and be like, oh yeah, but not all Marines are, goofballs like that one guy was back then. So we've always done that. We didn't need a class manufactured and then kind of told in a roundabout way, you all are kind of predisposed to being racist. And I would also ask that question of, well, what does that necessarily mean? How am I going to be biased towards, other categories of people? I'm kind of rambling just for a second. I apologize.
No,
to me, to me, it was a weird time in police culture, and I'm sure other, government entities did it as well. It got pushed out to different departments within local government. And across the board, most people that took the training were just like, what is this for? Like, we just kind of wasted multiple hours on multiple days to take this training. At the end of the day, we're all adults and we don't have that problem. We don't have rampant racism and we don't have rampant complaints against, different categories or whatever.
But it's the check in the box, right? This is, I think, the key is that those checks need to be had, because if there's some sort of issue that has happened in the past that we bring forward, and like you said, military units will kind of do this towards each other. And, when you, for us, when we're talking to other trades up here in the North, we slag each other all the time, but that slagging to somebody who doesn't have as much experience can become very real. Like when I say the tankers were all lazy and they never get off their tanks and da-da-da-da-da. If somebody doesn't have experience with them, that's going to become their bias just based off of the fact that I'm in a leadership position and that's what I say. So I think that those biases get developed at least through either poor leadership or through offhand comments that are just kind of softballed out there, as Sean would say. Chris, you were going to say something earlier. What were you thinking?
I think I was going to interject, and maybe we've moved on now, but the concept of implicit bias was developed by psychologists. The problem with it is, as more research has come out, it's been shown to be completely sort of a false and misleading concept that doesn't play out the way they claim. And these implicit bias trainings, from an effectiveness standpoint, don't have any effectiveness. They don't move the needle. You just said you and everybody around you took this training, but you were rolling your eyeballs all the way through it, and it didn't feel valuable or meaningful or even informed. It didn't seem like it was really meeting the audience that it was being presented to. And so, we as a nation have spent an enormous amount of money and time on initiatives like this that have no basis in empirical reality. There's no, this is one might call this concept of doing these implicit bias trainings really is indoctrination and brainwashing efforts to persuade you of something that isn't real.
Kind of like go ahead, Brian.
That was, I guess, the perception. It was like this idea of, you keep telling us these things over and over and over, but they're not true. Like you don't have proof of this. Like when I became a cop, like I said, I grew up in the South. So I'll give you bias, right? When I was a very young kid, I was into punk and skating and all that, and shaved my head. We were into hardcore music. And it was a time when America didn't understand this skinhead movement. So if I say the word skinhead right now, I'll show you bias right here. So if I say the word skinhead, what's some of the first things that pop into your mind, like right off the bat?
Neo-Nazis right off the bat.
Neo-Nazis, right?
Bad haircut.
There you go.
So growing up, I was very fortunate to grow up in a scene where there were skinheads everywhere. And let me tell you where skinhead, the whole movement, the look, music, everything, originated out of Jamaica. So Jamaican immigrants moving to England, late 60s, early 70s, took that look with them. The boots, the braces, the suspenders, everything.
So
Jamaica,
Jamaica,
it was flight jackets, had nothing to do with racism. Nothing. Throughout the 70s in England, you had a lot of like two-tone records and the whole ska movement. So you had black and white kids listening to ska music and being influenced by this whole look and this whole skinhead movement. Again, nothing to do with racism. Comes to America very late 70s, early 80s, and spreads in the punk and hardcore scene and ska scene in America. Thousands of kids are skinheads. And then it gets hijacked by the neo-Nazis. And then what happens is in 87 or 88, somewhere around there, on the Geraldo show, there's a Geraldo Rivera TV show, and there were skinheads in the audience who were not racist, but then the panel on the show were Nazi skinheads. And so then the fight breaks out, and they break Geraldo's nose by throwing the stool or chair or whatever. And then the whole country in America now has this image burned in their head of any white males with a shaved head, flight jacket, suspenders and boots are Nazis. When in reality, they were probably at that time about 3% of the entire look of the skinhead movement. So when I was a little kid and my buddies and we would go see bands play, people would start yelling at us and calling us Nazis. And we were actually the opposite of that. It's crazy. But that bias is still going. I created training years ago on skinhead and subcultures. And that's how I start the class. I write skinhead on the board. And everyone always goes, hey, Nazis, violence, But that's bias, when people see that look. So I've spent many years, I trained my entire department and others, hey, understand this movement, that it's anti-racist. Like skinheads as a whole culture are not racist. Yeah. It's the look that got hijacked by groups like Hammerskins, which is a racist organization.
It's interesting how quickly negative players can completely destroy an innocuous kind of group, which is interesting. And I find that I remember back in the early 90s when Doc Martens got labeled as racist because the skinheads were wearing them. And then then no one was allowed to wear Doc Martens. And I'm like, they're nice boots though. Like it's kind of hilarious. It's a bit of a challenge, but I wonder how much of it is our own kind of psychology of just attributing bad actors to a stereotype. I would think. Chris, you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I think we're talking about bias as a form of ignorance. I don't know anything about skinheads. All I remember is that Geraldo show. So I have no education. My bias there in saying neo-Nazis is I've revealed my ignorance. And so I think that's partly what a lot of bias is. It's just simple ignorance. On the other hand, let me ask this: is bias necessarily ignorance? Is it necessarily a bad thing? I would suggest it's not.
That is a good question. Sean, what do you think? You've been real quiet for a while. Let's hear from you.
I have, because I like it. I like where we're going. And, just to clear my perspective on skinheads or my own experience. So, I was born and raised in England for the first 10 years and then moved to Canada. And so at the time before we moved from England, the skinhead scene was popping off. And I got to tell you, like as a 10-year-old kid, walking to school and seeing buddy with the thin braces and the attitude leaning up against the brick wall and giving me the stink eye, him and his buddy, like I instantly categorized them as a threat. Like the vibe they were giving off was all about the, they're going to beat me down. They had that twinkle in their eye that wasn't smiley. And so, they weren't doing the movement any favors at all. And I like ska, man. I like two-tone. I like the scene, but I didn't like the vibe that some bad characters were giving off back in the day. And so I've carried that as a bias for the rest of my life. I love the scene. I don't love the dude who's giving me the attitude. And so there's cool attitude and there's villainous attitude.
Go back to our ancestors. Think about our ancestors living in tribes. You're that kid walking past another tribe and they're giving you stink eye and you don't know what their intentions are. You don't know who they are. They're not your people. They look different. They act a little different. So to have your threat assessment elevated makes sense. And that's kind of our hunter-gatherer tribal nature for who we were, humans were for hundreds, maybe millions of years, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years. That tribe on the other side of the river, they might not have been friendly. They might have looked a little different. They might have eaten a little different. And so for us to have biases was a way of protecting ourselves.
I would say that's reading body language, though, right? Like you see the eyes, the you give me the stink eye, you mean mug me.
Yeah.
But I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
It is true. I think that we can articulate a lot of times that threat being from the expressions, the body language, or like Sean was saying, if dudes are leaning up against the wall, arms crossed, and they're looking at you like, I'm going to stomp you, then they could be in a three-piece suit and still be a threat because of the body language. Or throw them in that traditional, skinhead attire. And now you're going to associate all skinheads with that violence. Also, you can have a sharp skin, you beat the brakes off of somebody too. So, there's violence in every movement. But I agree with you. I do think through our process as human beings and generation after generation, we do survive in that sense of, okay, what is a known threat? Well, we know this is a known threat. Like you said, if there's a tribe, across the river or creek, and, people within our tribe have had problems or violence, then until two people sit down and squash it or get past that bias, and you're going to have that. And I do think that in society, we do have to be careful. There's such a big movement with like branding and really putting your name out there and your image and whatever products you're moving. And growing up, when I was growing up and reading about the military before I joined the Army, all I really had were like books on Vietnam units. And then maybe people that I knew in my family or friends of my parents. And it was often like very quiet. I didn't hear a whole lot of, there I was, frags going off and body limbs being cut off and stuff. But I would read about it in books. And so therefore in those books, I would associate that with certain units. So when I joined the Army, I knew exactly what I wanted to do based off of those few books that, were out there. And now there's hundreds of books and people telling their stories. And then the bias comes in with different units. So there's always like a running joke. If someone says, that person's a Navy SEAL, there's always a running joke of like, they must have like nice hair and, they've written a book and this sort of thing. It's a joke. It's, poking fun at one another. But that bias exists, the same way with the word operator. So when people hear the word operator, they may think, special operations, JSOC, these different things. Or they may say, hey, I've heard that word enough. I've heard it used so many times by people who are telling stories that aren't true. It almost gives it that negative connotation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I got a question for you on this too, because Sean and I were talking a while ago on one of the episodes about how important your reputation is. and that reputation preceding you, and that how people view you before you even meet them. And I was, interestingly enough, we were sitting at the table, and my boys were looking at a new shirt that I have, which is the Black Devil shirt, for Special Service Force
Mm-hmm.
from World War II that a buddy of ours produces. And they were all like, "Wow, that's such a cool shirt. I like the devil and da da da."
Yeah.
I'm like, "Okay, well, do you guys want to hear the story of them?" And I relayed what they did and some of the things, and both of my boys were just awestruck, and they were like, "Whoa, that's crazy!" And as you were talking, it started making me think about the fact that they created a bias within the enemy ranks just by what they were doing. They were creating reputation of what they were doing. So their actions led to a future bias, which is quite an interesting prospect. And I want to get your guys' thoughts on that. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Could you fill out just a little bit more about what that reputation was, what they were doing?
Absolutely. So one of the I say hilarious, but it was pretty brutal at the time, was they would sneak into enemy encampments, they would slit some throats, and then they would leave a little calling card that said, "You've been attacked by the Black Devils." I can't remember what the actual wording was, but it was basically, that was one of the things they did. Another one, they took over an entire town with, I think it was like 3 or 4 enemy casualties, but they captured the entire town in a single night. Sean, I think, has a bit more experience with the history on them, but they would do things specifically to make the Germans fear them.
So to have a reputation of being lethal, skilled, dangerous, and that intimidates the enemy. And that is a reputation, but that's also what soldiers have always, at some level have always tried to do. I mean, isn't that what face paint is about? Of warriors going into battle to look more scary. Isn't that what all the colors and plumes and things on uniforms going way back is about? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good point. Sean, you got any thoughts on this?
No, I don't. I feel that I'm in line with Chris. I think that since the dawn of man, someone has been putting on a gold breastplate. Someone has had a tassel dangling off their spear. As humans, we've always tried to use the tools that we've got, both physically and psychologically and emotionally, the tools that we've got to achieve the aim that we have intentions of achieving. And so whether that be in our modern society on a sidewalk by wearing skinhead boots to either send a message or intimidate a message or explain who they are or explain their beliefs, or we've been doing it from time immemorial. So I think that what we're talking about is not specific to any industry. It's people. We have been projecting who we are and our intentions into the future for a long time. In fact, I would go so far as to say that, Chris's use of the word plume is what's got me thinking about this. Everyone on the sidewalk has some form of plume. And it's really, I think, to make it kind of binary to some degree, I think really it comes down to whether your plume is for good or for evil. And I know those are big words, but in the spirit of things, I think that if you can consider them as massive delta between you're doing it right and you're doing it wrong, well, there's a ton of ground in between those two positions that people should be playing with to better understand who they are and how to operate in society. You'd asked me earlier, Chance, what my thoughts are on this. And it might seem a little controversial initially, but I think I'm going to throw it out there just to create not chaos, but just to create a little bit of friction in the conversation. I think that biases, whether it's implicit bias or not, I think bias is necessary. Because if we were all homogenous if we were all just tribes that were vanilla across the river and vanilla on this side of the river, and we all thought the same and we all talked the same and we all wore the same plumes, the friction wouldn't have existed for us to get to this point right now. We'd be behind the 8 ball if not for biases. And the reason that we're further ahead as a society or as humans is because biases are always going to be in place, but it's what we do with them and how we get better from the discussion of these biases.
I got a question from the Instagram side here, one of the comments that kicked in here, and he said, it's from Tyler Pelkey. With Tyler, good to see you, buddy. He says, we all have unconscious bias. So in the sense of sometimes we don't know what we don't know, how does one become aware of our biases? And so I want to throw this question to you guys. How have you become aware of your own biases and what you do about it? Brian, you're on top. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the first thing is, if you're doing something that alters or changes your normal daily pattern or what you were getting ready to do. Here's an example. I know a guy that walked out of a grocery store. He's a big dude, like a weightlifter. And it's 2 or 3 in the morning. It's like a 24-hour Walmart. He goes out, he's walking out in the parking lot. 3 guys start approaching him. Now he, for the story, you got to understand, since we're talking about bias, he is a white male. There are 3 black males walking up to him in the parking lot. An entire Walmart parking lot, no one's around at 2 or 3 in the morning. They're walking straight towards him. And he said he had the thought that like something bad's about to happen. And then he thought, I don't want to judge these guys. They're probably just hanging out or whatever. That's his internal dialogue. And then all of a sudden, one guy goes left, one guy goes right, and one guy walks straight towards him. And they basically flank him, pull a gun out, tell him to run his pockets. And if y'all don't know what that means you're getting robbed. So they rob him at gunpoint, take his money, and then run off. And as they're running through the parking lot, they fire a couple rounds up in the air, like celebratory rounds. So as he's telling me this account later, and he says, it made me feel bad for thinking that they were going to do something wrong because they were black. And I said, you didn't think that. I don't think race had anything to do with it, because your brain was working so quickly that you realized it's 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, a huge empty parking lot, and 3 guys are walking straight towards you. And when they each flank you, which is not normal behavior, when you're walking in a triad and you're talking and all that, you all kind of collectively walk around someone, or you got to figure out why in the hell they're zeroing in on you in the parking lot. And I think his brain was just doing all these calculations because he wasn't a racist guy. Like, that's the thing. So, but his brain was this almost like this internal dialogue of, hey, I shouldn't think these things, and it's happening in nanoseconds. And then they rob him. He was reading the behavior correctly, even though he wasn't a cop, he wasn't trained, he's an average guy. But his brain was like, yeah, this is not normal, and it's calculating, boom, 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 boom. And then here comes the threat. You could switch it, and I could leave race out of it, and it wouldn't matter. But I think that in society, everything has gotten so, I say society, in American, Canadian society, across the world, a lot of countries, there's this division and this idea that almost everybody is racist. And I think it's the opposite. I've grown up in the South. I've talked to generations, and I've seen how the evolution has occurred in society. I don't know people who are racist in that sense. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so the idea of this bias, his was, again, based on their behavior. But what happened is it got him into a situation where he was victimized. Now, I don't know whether he would have walked out of that store, saw them, read the situation immediately, and then acted on it. Either turn around, walk back in the store, which is probably the safest bet, even though probably he could have beat 1 or 2 of the guys up. They had guns. They were going to rob him. So the coolest thing to do is to just button hook and go right back in Walmart, right? And hang out. But that whole idea of bias, he became very aware in the instant, oh, I'm being biased. And then continued on his course. So I would say that if you become aware of it, if something is causing you to change your course of behavior, So throughout the day, if I'm avoiding whatever, going, to a certain store because I don't like where it is in the city, or I don't like whoever's there, but it's not grounded in actual experience. It could just be, hey, I'll pick this off the top of my head. I don't like this store because everyone there speaks in a Long Island accent. I'm wearing Long Island out today, but that would be a bias. If I'm realizing, oh, I don't want to go to that store, I'm changing my daily behavior. That's probably one of the easier ways to realize that.
So it's a social or cultural imprint. And what that guy was thinking at that point was, oh, I don't want to be that guy. I bet that's a sentence that went through his head as those three fellas were about to flank him. Oh, I don't want to be that guy. And by that I mean, and we talked about this 2 days ago on the show about justice. A lot of people think that they understand justice, but they've never been formally trained in justice. And by justice, I mean, like, a lot of police officers haven't been formally trained in justice. They've been formally trained in the law. Justice is a different thing than the machinations of the machine, the law machine. Justice is an entirely different thing. And not a lot of people in regular lives are taught how to be righteous. And justice is based on kind of transparent or truthful or observable, fair, righteous actions. And so in that moment in the Walmart parking lot, there was the law, there was the social overlay of, oh, I don't want to be that guy. And then there was the understanding of what's just in the moment or what is right in the moment. Those are all different things. And so, as we said a couple of days ago, if you've never been formally trained as a kid, like when you were 6 years old, if you weren't taught what's right and wrong, then from that point on, you kind of make it up until someone like grabs you, holds your hand, steers you, or sits you down in a lecture hall and explains to you what righteousness means. Then your bias is to just make it up along the way. What you can and can't get away with, what you will and won't say around this person, which is different than that person. We make it up as we go along. And so that individual, that big weightlifter, his output in that moment is a result of his make it up as he goes along. That's what we all do. And so that's why I think bias is not a negative, and I don't think it's a positive. It's just a thing that we have to figure out in order to do better rather than worse.
Interesting. Chris, you got any thoughts on any of this?
Well, where would we be without bias? And I guess just kind of piggybacks on to Sean's point. I think bias serves a very important role for us. And if we didn't have biases, I mean, another way of just saying what is a bias, it's an opinion, maybe. And it's applying an opinion based on some kind of experience to somebody who doesn't maybe fit, or to some situation that doesn't fit. But because we've had, 10 times we've met somebody wearing a purple feather on top of their head, and it didn't go well. The next time we meet somebody with a purple feather on their head, we're going to be cautious. And I think that's where a lot of, so much of this comes from our ancestral DNA evolution. This is something our ancestors have always had to struggle with. But let me ask about another kind of bias, and maybe another definition of bias. Sometimes you hear, oh, the media is biased. CNN has a bias. Fox News has a bias. Wall Street Journal, New York Times, they have different biases. They tell the same stories, but sometimes with their biased opinion and interpretation of some of the news. Are those really biases, though?
Yes.
A lot of that to me seems like intentional propaganda.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
are self-selected.
Not an
Self-selected forms.
unacknowledged, unrealized bias, but an actual. Hey, here's how we want to affect change. Here's how we want to influence people.
Yeah, I would say 100%. The propaganda, they know what they're doing. There are plenty of people who have written articles, for multiple publications, and their editor creates the title, creates the article title.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been several writers who have either resigned or have spoken, out against their editor, saying, I'm now catching backlash because I wrote an article that actually states this, but the headline reads the opposite. And because society's moving so fast, people see it on their phone, scroll past it, whatever. They see who wrote the article, they read that title, and the outlet already has their click, or their views, so they're going to get paid, from their sponsors. But the writer now is stuck with, hey, I'm building my reputation on this article and my work, and then you come in and put this, either because it's straight up a business, so you're going to make more money by hyperbolizing stuff, or like you said, there is not even a hidden, but a outwardly agenda of this is the political slant or whatever the slant they want to put on things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm with you. That's not bias. That's just straight up either geniuses at getting us to click and like and share so their sponsors increase, or it's more political propaganda.
I disagree.
What's that?
Why? Hit it, Sean. What do you got?
So what we're talking about is a information source. So let me change that into what we're talking about is the purple-plumed tribe across the river. It's just a data point. It's just an information source. It's just a thing. Mm-hmm. It's us that are biased by self-selecting the news source that we want to read. And by self-selecting, I'm never going to read anything from that guy because he always puts out the worst. And so that's on us. The game all around is in a 360 degree. That's existed since there was a purple plumed tribe across the river. That's been going on forever. But we self-select what we believe in, and we self-select what we align with, and we self-select who we have around us. And so when it is not in alignment with what we select, our bias is then on perhaps a continuum from 0 to 10 of, maybe I'll think about that, all the way through to, well, that's just diabolical. And so that's on us. That isn't on the source. Now, I understand I've simplified things. Of course, the purple-plumed crew across the river could all be devils. They could be the worst, for sure. They
probably are.
They might be, but if they are, it's our bias that is the impetus for us to observe if they're devils or not. Because if without bias, we just saunter through all the purple-plumed tribes in the world and not really be aware. And so I like to reverse engineer the bias when it comes to a news source, like name a news source that is doing it poorly. I don't try to blame them. I try to blame me for not trying to understand what they're putting across and somehow absorb it in a palatable way.
I blame the hell out of them. I mean, I do. I'm not a dummy. You know what I mean? Like, I look at, news outlets and sources like that with that purpose of, yellow journalism over 100 years ago. And then when I was a kid, again, back to punk rock, bands were like telling us even back then, question everything. It's just news that you're seeing on TV is a business. That was back in the 80s. I was a kid and realizing, the nightly news, their job is to get ratings because the bands like Dead Kennedys and all these other bands were singing about it. And it's only gotten worse because it's a 24-hour news cycle and it's international and it's just constant. But it's still a business. Every one of them, the only way they're going to survive is to make money. And I don't like being manipulated. Yeah, I don't like being manipulated And I know that people that work in a news business usually are wordsmiths. They know how to put words and what the buzzwords are, and things like race. If you can interject race, boy,
Look, it's all that's true. That's all true. That's all very true. My statement was for Sean, not for the masses, because I understand these things. I have the nuance to be able to understand how the current world is operating. Not everyone does. Mm-hmm. And so when I say I appreciate observing the world how I observe it, it works for me, but it doesn't work for everyone. And so for sure, there's a bunch of people that fell off the back of the turnip truck that don't get it. They just lap it up for what it is. They take it on as if it is factual. And therein lies the problem. But for Sean, it isn't a problem. And so I fail to separate the idea between I have a critical eye, whereas maybe not everyone else has a critical eye. There's people who are way smarter than I am. There's people who are way more critical than I am. There's people who've got it figured out way better than I do. But I fall down from that high level of understanding to maybe a 6 out of 10. And 6 out of 10 is good enough for me right now to be able to navigate the world with a bit of a clearer view than 1 out of 10. And there's a lot of 1 out of 10 out there.
Mm. I have a question on this, and it has to do with the speed. Like, Brian, you brought up the fact that the 24-hour news cycle, and we all have our phones, and we're able to access information immediately. I was having a conversation with my wife, actually, the other day, and I mentioned, the fires that are going on in LA right now, and the fact that, it's all over social media and the news, and I got some interesting views on it from all different angles. People are saying that it's a conspiracy. People are saying it's a wildfire. People are saying it's arsonists. It's friggin' all over the place. But I thought back to 100 years ago, where someone up in, Alberta, Canada, if there was a fire in LA, it would burn through, it would be all done and taken care of, whatever that means, before it even hit my desk, before it even got to my house, where I would read it in the newspaper and I would just see LA burns. And then I'd be like, oh my God. And then I'd have to read the newspaper, and I'd get all that information, as much information as I could from that source. And then I'd try to find other sources, or maybe I know some people, I'd write letters. There would be a delay. And so I'm wondering, do you think that perhaps the speed at which we're intaking information directly applies to the amount of bias that we look at it from? Or do you think that, perhaps by being slower, we would have less bias because we would expect more information from different sources? What do you guys think? Chris, I'm going to hit you first.
I think bias is there so that we can respond immediately in those nanoseconds. We don't have to, bias is there so we can make split decisions without getting all the information. It's a head start on responding to something that we don't know what it is. When we have more time, after we get off the call here, I could go, not saying I will, but I could go and do some research and read up on skinheads and learn more about what skinheads are and where they come from and what they do. And I could start to change my bias. But I don't have time to do that if I'm walking down the street and there's some skinhead giving me stink eye and tapping his hip. I got to go with my bias in that moment. And yeah, I'm reading the cues, but part of the cue is my bias. Oh yeah, skinheads, neo-Nazis, bad, dangerous.
And then when you deviate across the street and save your own life and keep walking, nobody knows any different. You know what I mean? That's the beauty of it. Is that you're right?
Yeah. So biases serve a purpose. They're shortcuts.
Yeah, and I will say, back to the media. So myself and others in our field. So when I retired, I was a homicide lieutenant. So I came up through the ranks. I did it as a detective, did it as a sergeant, and oftentimes the minute a deceased person is located, you don't even know yet what you have other than a person who is deceased. The news is on it. And so they're contacting the department and they want to know information. I get it, because again, it's a business and the community should know as much information as possible in order to protect the integrity of the case. And so there have been arguments I've had with individuals about, we are not going to release any information right now. The only thing you can say is that the police department responded to this location and that we're on scene working an active investigation. That's it. Don't say another word, because if you put something out there, rapid fire, and you even use a word like whatever, a homicide, that the police department responded and they are working a homicide investigation, you've now given the public the image that the person who is deceased was murdered. And what happens when your investigation turns out that they in fact committed suicide, right? So it's one of those ideas you can't, in order to try to backtrack and then explain to people, no, that this person was not murdered, it was suicide. Oh, that's because the police want to cover it up, or that, and then some craziness comes involved. Whenever I'm intaking anything that's news related, and I stopped watching the news on a regular basis, probably back 2015-ish, somewhere around there, just because I didn't want to keep taking in negativity. And, I knew at least locally, 60% of it was halfway right. You know what I mean? I'm like, the stories aren't even accurate. So I'm gonna tap out and do other things. But when the news cycle is so rapid like that, like you just said, right now people are even speculating about LA. Is it arson? Is it a natural disaster? That sort of, who can we blame for water not being in fire hydrants anymore and all this stuff? And it could be all of it. Some could be arson. Some could be fires being set. Some could have been natural. Like, you won't know until weeks down the road. And sadly, everything has gotten so fast that the half truths come out like that. And then now all of a sudden, if you want to put a political angle, you can do that, in these events that are happening. So it does create bias because of that, just like that whole idea of a fire has occurred and immediately people are jumping in with who to blame and that sort of thing. I think we are living in a very, I say crazy, that's a stupid term, but we're living in an era right now, I think, that 20, 30 years from now, people are going to look back at this time and kind of be dumbfounded at a lot of, I think, the nonsense that gets pushed out in major news cycles. When in fact, I think they often have the accurate, or at least the information, they could be a little more accurate. But if they give the whole truth, then it's not a really good soundbite, or it's not a really good trailer for the news source. So they give you that half truth, and then you click in, and then a month down the road or a couple weeks down the road, you find out it was basically a non-event, and they knew from the very beginning because they pulled the 911 call and they heard the 911 call, but they only want to give you the 10 seconds when actually in the whole 3 minutes of a 911 call, all the facts.
That's a good point, Sean. What do you got?
So yesterday afternoon, someone sent me a video to my Instagram DMs, just pushed it forward to me. And it's a clip of a guy from Alberta who is not plugged into any secret sauce. It's just all his bizarre opinion from his garage. And he's populating the idea that the fires in LA were started in order to burn down LA to get rid of the pedophile list. And so, I mean, it's laughable, but let's pretend that there's an element of truth to it. And I mean a shred of truth. Well, back in the day, even if there was a shred of truth to that, next to nothing would have come of that story, because there wasn't an ability of a guy in Alberta to start spreading his nonsense. So what I'm going to suggest is this: there isn't enough bias in people's biases. Like, when that video got pushed to me, the only response I had to the person who pushed the video to me was, "Thanks for sending me the video of a guy with a double-digit IQ."
Mm-hmm.
And so if I don't put a stop on it, if I just type back LOL, or I push it forward myself, Well,
Mhm.
I wasn't biased enough on my biases. And so everything that comes into my inbox, everything that gets pushed to me, any word that gets said to me, I'm looking at the person as an information source that gets the trust that it deserves based on the track record that I've engaged with over either a second or a lifetime. If you're my friend for 12 and a half years, then you're getting my 12 and a half year trust evaluation. If you just jumped onto my radar a second ago, you're getting a 1 second evaluation of this is unlikely to be true. And so our bias of our biases aren't often evaluated. We just run with our biases. We never double check what's going on with our initial responses. So, this fire in LA is interesting, but it's allowed a dude in Alberta to spread his message within about 4 seconds of the fire being lit, which is insanity, of course.
Well, and then had you forwarded that message, and then like you forward it to a bunch of other people, and then they forward it, and it gets traction, and it just reinforces that kind of behavior. People have gotten upset with me because they'll send me stuff, and I'm just like, sometimes I even have to tell them. Like, a guy sent me a clip, and this was about, I don't know, maybe like 2 years ago or something, and it was like a fight on the sidewalk, and a guy basically pulls out a knife and stabs the other guy right in the neck, hits the femoral artery. And so it's like, did I say femoral artery? I didn't mean femoral artery. The other thing that runs blood up in your
Carotid?
neck.
Maybe the carotid.
Carotid, that's it. Hit the carotid, and it of course, boom, it just starts to puddle out. And I didn't want to see that specific day. Like we had been working probably about 30 hours straight on a homicide, and like the last thing I wanted to see was one human being killing another. And so when I saw, I was like, all right, and I just said, like, hey, for future reference, like I don't want to see this stuff. And I was very tactful because I like the guy. He's not a bad guy, but in his world, this may not have had that kind of effect on him because it's just some strangers on a flat screen, almost like watching TV or something. But to me, I don't know. I like human beings. I have a strong connection to people in general. It bothered me. And so but I didn't have to worry about any more of that stuff getting sent to me. My point of that story is these videos just get pushed and pushed and pushed along. And the more views they get, the more people set up these accounts to push this stuff out there. And it's almost like this craving for it, which is a whole other topic. But that ability or whatever that we have with this technology to push this stuff out, to me, I think that we as people can control it by not forwarding, by not clicking and watching, not, if I see some clickbait and it has anything like that, I try not to mess with it because I don't want to reinforce that. Yeah. I mean, sometimes you got to click it and you're like, I wish I wouldn't have seen that. But yeah.
Depends on the day. Like there's, I see a lot of stuff from the military still, and I see a lot of stuff that's going on in Eastern Europe and Ukraine and all that stuff. And there's live feed now, which is interesting because this is kind of new to the world, and the fact that there's live feed war that you can just watch, which I think not only creates more bias based on which side, like who's controlling the video feed really at that point, but also the fact that people that don't have any experience in any particular avenue. So if for using that example, if I were to send that video off to somebody that has no idea what self-defense is, or no idea in first aid training, or just like a complete rando that has no experience, that's going to be almost traumatic for somebody.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But if I send that to somebody that has some medical experience, or
hang on a sec. So it would have been, I'm not saying it would or wouldn't have been traumatic. What I am going to say is this: it would have been more traumatic 10 years ago.
Yes.
And less traumatic today. And I think that's the crux of the matter that we're talking about on this particular subject. The lack of the lack of critical analysis in the moment. So when that DM comes into your inbox and you look at that video and you think, that's just one more video of the millions of videos that I've seen over the last 10 years that has worn me down to the moment where someone getting stabbed in the neck is a non-factor. Like, it just doesn't even make you blink. It's just like watching a cartoon. So that's how we've been numbed down as a society. The only way to inject a pattern interrupt there to go on a different trajectory when you see these kind of things come in is just to take a moment and apply some freaking critical analysis before you click the re-share button. I mean, honestly, we've all got heads on our necks, and no matter how ill-educated you are on any subject, if you know nothing about it, it's your responsibility to think before you reshare.
Yeah. I was gonna that it is a fantastic point you made there, Sean, and it's 100% true. I was going down the lane of the fact that experience will give you a better concept of manage your own bias, right? So if I want to send that to somebody, if there's a something that I see on the internet and I'm like, wow, you know, Sean would really love this. I think Sean would like that. Giving me the time to actually process that instead of like, whoa, that's cool, I'm going to send it to everybody.
Yeah.
The experience of life, of being involved in things that are going around and actively thinking, to your point, Sean, actively taking the time to A, do I need an opinion on this? B, do I need somebody else's opinion on this? And then C, do I need to send this to anybody? Can I just like end the cycle right here and just call it a day? And Sean, you and I were chatting at one point where you had to go online and be like, stop sending me friggin' memes. Stop sending me reels, because I don't want to waste my life watching dumb stuff on the internet. I got better things to do. And it's very true. I think if we don't take the responsibility of our own information gathering, you're just going to get led along in whatever realm people are sending stuff to you. And I think that's it's a challenge because as Tyler pointed out earlier on the comment, you don't know what you don't know until you know what you don't know. And then it goes from there.
Yeah, the whole critical thinking aspects that, you know, we were talking about earlier, and just the whole movement almost away from that, and how people say, oh, well, I fall in this bracket, therefore I have to think this way. I'm prior Army, so therefore the Army can do no wrong. That's BS. Or I'm a former, you know, cop, therefore every YouTube video I see, the officer is correct. I will tell you about 99% of the time they are right. But if you can see the whole video, but for that 1 or 2% that are just jacked up and wrong, the harshest critics are the people that come from that field. I mean, we all know that. It's just like this idea of, you know, trying to stay neutral at least, and use critical thinking. And I don't know, dude. I'm over all of the hyped up news stories, and I also hate seeing outlets, you know, that push information out or repost things, and they get hungry and they want more and more views and likes, and then you see it happening the same way it happened with journalism or network TVs or, you know, newspaper publications. They start to do some of those exact same things. They try to be a little more salacious, or they show you the 10-second clip when 30 seconds would have been fine, because you would have watched the 30 seconds and realized this is a non-event. You know what I mean? Like, it just is. Yeah. But
I like the way you put that those with experience are usually the harshest critics, because it's usually the truth. I mean, if I were to watch somebody, actually we had this during Remembrance Day last year, there were a bunch of videos going around of some really bad drill and some really bad parades and things like that. And the people who were speaking the loudest were the military guys who were like, no, that's not right. That's not okay. We shouldn't be doing that. That due to the fact that we're biased to what our training is, or biased to the level of whatever we worked on. And I think that's
we also know that people have bias towards us, so we don't want that image out there. So when I watch anyone in a police uniform doing something, and a lot of times the videos that I watch that get me upset are not the deadly encounters. They're almost 99% of the time they are locked in and they're doing exactly what they should do to stop that threat. If you can watch the whole video and you have access to that, then you fully understand that. But we don't always get that. What I end up on, like a lot of threads now, are of officers doing things now, I mean, on like a routinely basis that we never would have done over the last 20 or 30 years, because we've learned that it will get you killed. And you can watch it in a video where officers are turning their backs on known threats, people who are hostile. People are literally saying, I'll punch you in the face. Take that badge off. I'll beat you down on it. And then an officer will turn their back on that person. And we know in our culture, like, that's a sign of disrespect, or like, I don't have time for you. But we in the field knew, there were stories handed down of officers who were shot and killed or attacked from behind. You never let anybody stand behind, period. It was just a good rule. Like, I don't have to assess whether this, 45-year-old man is going to attack me or not. I just got to keep him in front of me while I talk to him, or position myself to always be at the advantage and to stay at least more than one arm length away from the person I'm talking to. And all of these like kind of fundamentals are breaking down. And I know a lot of that, and I won't go on into the details of it. But when I watch those videos, it does drive me crazy. And I am like the harshest critic for that, because on patrol I was a field training officer, and I trained rookies in the car on the field. I mean, you're grabbing people and going, okay, hey, put the handcuffs on them, or hey, I'm going to pull the gun out of his waistband. You keep control of his hands or his legs, or whatever it is. So, yeah, I knew that all that knowledge and information, if I pass it on to these officers, their probability of surviving increases greatly. And then the next generation, so that police work would become safer in the sense of less assaults and less deadly threats, because we are changing our behavior in order to counter that. And it's crazy. I'll tell you one real quick. Watch videos and you'll see officers. A lot of departments now have vests, which are good, like some will call them tack vests or kits or whatever you want to call it. But basically, it's got the ballistic panels in the front and back, and then they have pockets, for their equipment, which is incredible, because when you're chasing someone and you're wearing a duty belt, it's harder to run. You throw on a vest like that and you get an extra gear. But they will stick their hands inside the tops of the vest as they're talking to people. And it drives me crazy, because it's the equivalent of putting your hands in your pockets. And guess what? That's when you get stolen. That's when someone punches you in your face. Or, worse than that, they draw a weapon or pull a weapon. But you watch these videos and you see that. You see these officers sticking their hands in everything. And it's just comfort. It's a habit. And no one is training them or telling them, hey, the threat is coming. Every encounter could be deadly. So at least have your hands out. Have your hands up while you're talking to people. I talk with my hands a lot anyway. So it's always good, because I could just be talking like that and then snatch somebody up if I needed to.
So I think the failure is not like when you're a field officer training a rookie, and I'm generalizing. I think the failure is not because you're teaching a person well or not. I think the failure nowadays is because this sentence is never said often enough. Hey, bro, you got to do it better. You know why? Because if you don't, you're screwing it up for all of us. Mm-hmm. That wasn't a big deal 20 years ago. But nowadays, it's a big deal, because if you purport yourself, or if you stand there incorrectly, if you turn your back on someone incorrectly and it gets caught on video, Now everyone thinks it's cool if you turn your back in that moment. And everyone knows that anyone who's well trained knows it isn't cool. But every time that back gets turned, it dulls down the appropriateness of what is supposed to happen in the moment versus what can happen in the moment. And so back by back by back by back, every time a back is turned, it then normalizes that that's okay to do that until something goes bad, until that person gets clubbed upside of the head. But if that isn't shown in the video, and if that isn't used as it's not about this incident, it's about the message that was sent before the incident. We all made it okay. We all didn't speak up. We all didn't shake our finger at that individual before they got clubbed upside of the head. And so it's less about the moment and it's more about the message for the future that I think isn't strongly put across enough.
Yeah. And 20, 30 years ago, it was the exact same thing, though. It was, hey, this is how you survive. And also, like you said, this is the image. If you run like a hot block, like you're going into areas where there's violence, there are gang members, there are drug dealers, pick your bracket. If you're rolling in there day to day and you do stuff like that, back then it would have been putting your hands in your pockets. It would have been slumped shoulders. It would have been looking at the ground. Then the career criminal, the people with a mindset like that, they're always up to no good. Read that officer and immediately go, that's the one. I ain't messing with that one. Like that one I can run from. I can outfight them. Like that won't be the person that puts handcuffs on me and takes me to jail. But that uniform, that department can also just start to get that negative image, that bias of you don't care, you're not sharp. I did used to have supervisors and people who would say, hey, make sure, your boots are shined, make sure your buttons are shiny and all this stuff. And I was, prior Army, I understood all that. But when I would talk to people on the street, nobody ever really noticed that. If they noticed your boots, they were looking for who's got scuffed up boots because they knew you were the runner. You were the one that would mix it up. And so I didn't tell officers, hey, look like junk when you're out there, but let's put some priorities. Let's take that whistle chain off, throw that in your car because you're not going to need that because when you're in a foot pursuit, it's going to whip you in the face. Like let's strip your gear down to make sure everything looks good. Don't worry necessarily about your boots or your shoes. Like I want them to be working properly, but when we get out of the car, everybody here is going to judge you by the way you look, but how you carry yourself and that sort of thing. But the bias there with the videos and images is 20 years ago, what we didn't have was the ability for someone during a traffic stop to take a device in their hand and stream it live before anybody can touch it, edited it, whatever. We didn't have those capabilities. We could go back and watch car cameras. And then, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, a lot of stores had surveillance cameras. We could go back and watch those. And we would, as a profession, study encounters of all sorts, fights, and then make a science out of it, so to speak, like train people and teach them pre-fight indicators, pre-flight indicators. You start to see these nuances in body language that go, oh, that dude getting out of the car right there is getting ready to fight that officer. You could turn the volume down on videos, give me no context, and oftentimes I can watch someone getting out of the car and tell you whether it's going to go bad or not.
Yeah, you have a survivability bias, and this is something that I've noticed quite a bit, not only in the police but in the military circles, and is the fact that the people that have the experience usually can tell you these things, right?
Yeah,
I have done X, therefore when this happens, this is going to happen. When I see this is going to happen. The indicators that I was seeing overseas in Afghanistan on my last couple of days before I left country were very different than things I was seeing the very first days when I got there, right? Just based on the fact that I have the experience. The challenge, though, and this is where it gets tricky, is there's an old saying, no combat ready unit will pass inspection, and no inspection ready unit will ever pass combat. In the fact that that's the bias, right? Whether or not are you looking capable, or are you actually capable? And I think this is a key point that I want to touch on in terms of bias, is the fact that if you don't have any experience, your bias will tend towards the guys that look cool. That's why we see in the tactical space, right? Everybody's got all the cool stuff, but they don't know how to use anything. We see it in the martial arts world, right? I'm going to buy all the cool gis, don't know how to fight. Like that kind of stuff. So I'm wondering, from your guys' experience, where you've seen it in real life, how do we fight those biases? How do we fight that survivability bias of people who are just like, yeah, I had my hands in my pockets and I made it out of the fight, so I guess I can just put my hands in my vest or in my pockets or on my belt or whatever. I don't have to be ready. It's that level of complacency, I would think. What do you guys think? How do we fight that?
I know it was ingrained in me in the police academy. So our police academy, there's like 6 months, if I remember right. It's long. Way too long. I was ready. I was done with it. But when our instructors for arrest techniques and those blocks and firearms and stuff, they were all solid. And one of the dudes was an absolute like animal. He started the block off and told us a long story about when he was a rookie and he was cocky and he thought he could take on anybody. He was 21 years old and he got basically beat down, like to the ground, radio across the street. And he realized, I got to train better and I got to have a different mindset. Like this badge, this uniform means nothing to a person who's committed to violence. That same instructor would attack us for weeks on end at random times. It's like you would walk out of a classroom and say you're just going on a bathroom break or you're refilling your water or something. And he would be hiding in all these little like corners and stuff in the academy grounds and attack you as soon as you like turn around a corner. And so for a lot of people, they came from different backgrounds. Some people have never even been in a street fight and they're just walking along, heading to clouds. And he pops out from like the backside of a locker room or something and tackles you or sweeps your legs or does whatever, puts a training gun to your head and then tells you how, you're dead and whatever. If you've got kids or a mother or whatever, like, hey, we're going to have a funeral. I mean, it was effective. And what it did was condition you at every turn. You don't walk blindly into rooms like that. You're cautious. And then of course it just translates out onto the street. There has to be an environment like that in training. And one of the things and trends that went on probably 15 years ago was the whole that police departments and academies are militarized. So we need to get away from this militarization. And so therefore it's unprofessional to scream and yell at recruits or candidates. And it needs to be more like a college learning environment. And there's some give and go there. But I will say the training and then the culture in every police department has got to be that. Has got to be threat assessment on every level. And there's a healthy way to do all of that. And a lot of that is small things like that. Don't get in the habit of putting your hands in your vest. Don't get in a habit of thinking every call that you go on or dispatch is just going to be, oh, well, I'm just going to go talk to a citizen about an abandoned car, or what, like you're always locked in, and it's a lot easier to get through a shift and you have actually less uses of force, less fights, less foot pursuits when you're always locked on, as opposed to being kind of laid back or being in a department where they're not learning and teaching at every moment. Hey, there are constant threats. It doesn't matter what small town you're in, especially in the South, everybody's got a gun. It's just gun culture. And you got the most polite culture in America is in the South. Charles have the most
constant consequences, right?
Yeah, like they're just legit people walking around with guns on their hips, or have them concealed or have them in their car. But you know, I kind of joke about that, but also that idea of there's always a threat there. There's always a gun available. And I know we're kind of going off topic, but that whole idea of 90s, 2000s, 2010s, you look at police and the military, you know, across the board, Canada, America, you look at the images, and if people were filling out questionnaires, they would say, yeah, highly professional, you know, really good encounters. Like our internal affairs had probably about 15 years of the lowest rates of complaints on officers, external from citizens as well as internal coworkers complaining on coworkers. But yet there was a big push that police, you know, departments were corrupt and ill-trained and that sort of thing. Just that, because it was bias, you know, citizens watch one news story and then now they're kind of being told, hey, you got to hate the police. Like this is
bad actors, right?
yeah. It's great.
Sean, you got any thoughts on survivability bias?
Well, yeah, I do. And so Brian already raised the topic that I'm going to jump into here briefly, and that is, well, everyone down south has got a gun on their hip. And that is bias in itself, because in most cases, I believe, you know, when push comes to shove, if there was a moment where someone had to pull a gun off their hip to use it as a tool for whatever purpose, chances are they'd shoot themselves in their own silly foot. Or as they're pulling out the gun, they drop the magazine by accident or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, poorly trained, ill-educated, but relying on a tool as their bias in their mind that they are prepared, that they're good to go, that they can take care of anything, that all of the gym time, all of the skill training, all of the awareness that they should have had is all replaced by simply strapping something onto their hip as the example of, I'm good to go. And so it's rare that anyone is good to go with a tool on their hip unless they're in the freaking game on the regular.
Mm-hmm.
And so few people are. And so the weapon on the hip is a bias, in my opinion.
Yeah. Hey, so like when you talk about bias, I forgot to mention this. So like with SWAT teams and the gear and everything, it's like when I got into police work, that was the thing. A lot of my buddies were like, hey, I want to go SWAT. I want to go SWAT. Now, I was in a department at one point that had 3 full-time SWAT teams, like decked out. They've got all the gear. Each team has the exact same amount of stuff, same amount of membership. Like they were really good at what they do. But also there was a bias maybe within the department of really good cops, like street cops who could just get into stuff, get stolen cars, guns, and stuff. And then you would hear like detectives and other people say, oh, so-and-so made SWAT. There goes a good cop. Like now they're just going to go over to SWAT and be lazy. Like they're going to physically work out, but they're going to just focus on hitting doors, you know, dynamic, static, you know, using the word operator. And like these are the running jokes, like you bust each other's chops. And sometimes it was true. You know, sometimes there were people who made it probably to those teams that maybe weren't the greatest. And then you just kind of see them get so focused. And then eventually they get off of the unit and they don't know what to do. But it's funny because the image in TV, a lot of times, like, you know, the best cops there are become SWAT team members. And it's almost, it's probably like 50-50. Like really good street cops who are just, they're on it. They're getting into stuff every day. They a lot of times they will go into other proactive units, you know, or they become detectives and do a different set of skills like that. But it's always funny to see, like when you bounce around and go to other jurisdictions to do search warrants or to follow up on a fugitive or something, and you see all the different SWAT teams and people talking about gear and freaking out and, oh, I got this and I got that. And one of the best guys I knew, street cop, he's a robbery detective. He was on SWAT for years. Probably couldn't tell you what type of weapon he carried. He knew how to shoot it. He knew weapons. He could use them inside and out. Mag changes, clearing. But he's like, I could care less whether it's whatever, a SIG, Smith, all this stuff, terminal velocities. Like, I don't know. Like, I clear that room. I engage targets. I use it as a tool. That's the thing. Like, I don't get caught up on gear. And I always loved his personality. Like, when it came to that, like, it's just a tool. Like, do I sit around and talk about whatever hammer I swing to nail something on a deck or whatever? Or what drill I'm using to put the screw in a deck? Like,
This brings up an interesting point in my head, and I want to get your guys' thoughts on this one as well, is the bell curve. And that is that for the average, this is something that I noticed within my own self, my own thought pattern. It's how I broke out of a bias that I had already had, was the fact that when I would meet someone who was a particular, maybe a bad actor or something like that, and I would overlay a bias on that particular person or that particular group that they were a part of or whatever it was, the thing that I had to realize was the fact that there's a bell curve in everything, right? Like when I would talk about guys at the Hill, up at Dwyer Hill with JTF2, and my initial bias was to put them on a pedestal, right? Look at these operators. They're so cool. And look at all the stuff they do. And blah, blah, blah.
As you should.
Yeah. And no, I'm not saying they're not bad. I'm not saying they're horrible human beings, but there's people that make it there that are not great operators. There are people that make it into any unit that are going to be awesome. There's going to be people who are crap, and there's going to be a large portion in between, right? And that's the bell curve. You're going to have your extremes on either side, but the average, the most people within a particular group are going to be mostly solid. And I had to remove that bias in my head of like, anybody from the Hill is awesome, because they could just be a horrible human being that is tough, right? Like, that doesn't make them a good person. So I'm wondering about your own biases. Something that perhaps you've seen in yourself and gone, oh man, I got to sort that out.
My first one that comes to mind, I joined the Army, went to Fort Benning with the basic training, got to my unit, and there was a sergeant that at first, I mean, if we didn't wear rank, which we did, if we didn't wear rank, I would have thought he was a private with just kind of a little bit longer hair on top, because he just didn't function like a normal soldier. He was a mess. And then you see his shoulder, and he's got a Ranger tab. It's like in America, he goes to Ranger school, he gets tabbed, but we were an infantry unit. But I had read enough about Ranger school and units and stuff like, oh, that's high speed. So, and I had drill sergeants that had been to Ranger school and Ranger battalion and stuff. So I always thought that, like, oh man, if someone's got a Ranger tab, like right off the bat, boom, they're going to be a good leader. They're going to know their tactics. And so I remember talking to another guy who had been to Ranger school at that, close in time frame there. And he was like, that guy's a mess, and nobody knows how he got his tab. Like, somehow, some way, some people skate through. Who knows? Like, I'm quite sure on a daily basis, the captain's clerk or whatever was checking orders and stuff and being like, really? Did this guy? Or either maybe he just had like a short-term memory. So maybe he had mastered like everything in Ranger school and then gets back to the unit. He's like, data dump all that. Like, I'm done. I got the tab. I don't need to remember that stuff. But that was like my first, and I was young, man. I just turned 18. So that was like my first insight of like, okay, maybe not. Like, maybe I need to pay more attention to skills and behavior. And we had another quick story. We had a command sergeant major, when I was getting out. I only did 4 years. So like, as I'm getting out, I'm a very mature 21-year-old at the time, an E5 sergeant. And these new privates were all about who's got what special skill badges and all this stuff. And one of them asked the sergeant major, which was a weird thing to do anyway, some private going up and talking to sergeant major. But they'd asked the sergeant major where all his stuff was, where his like CIB, his combat infantry badge, or his EIB, or airborne wings, air assault wings, like Ranger tab, like where he had just basically like a sterile uniform, nothing but name tapes. And he basically, he was tactful in talking to the private, but he explained to the private, none of that matters on my uniform. I could have all those things or have none of them, which he did. He had all of them. He just chose not to wear them, and he's a command sergeant major. Nobody's going to correct him. But his thing was, do your job, learn your skill, and if you're a gunner, know your weapon. You know, if you're a team leader, know your people, know your tactics, know your movements. Don't get caught up on this stuff. Like if someone has airborne wings or they don't have airborne wings, if they have a EIB, expert infantryman's badge, or they don't, do they at least know their job kind of thing? It was pretty cool to see that because he was like the only person I ever remember in an infantry unit, kind of almost like not discrediting, but just saying, don't get caught up on whatever is up on somebody's chest. Like pay attention to the people who actually know their job. So I don't know, that was pretty cool.
I like it. Sean, thoughts on this?
Well, I think that the people with all the stuff on their chest, they often don't concern themselves with that kind of stuff because they already know the deal. Like in order to get stuff on your chest, you've got to figure a few things out. And then once you've got the stuff, then you kind of look around and don't look for the stuff on the chest. You look at the man.
Yeah.
You look at their abilities in the moment, not what they did 10 years ago or 27 years ago, but who are you right now? Can you still kick that ass? And if you can't kick that ass, then you can wear all your badges, but I'm less impressed. I'll always give a nod to someone's service. I'll always give a nod to someone's badges. But if you're a goof who has lost your way, then the badge, I don't know, man. It's a thing, but it ain't a nod. You know, it's not a legit nod if you're a bad human being. And so I think we all have our little moments in our lives where we get badges and when we don't get badges, but it's who you are as you're standing there. And so I'm going to use that statement to launch directly into something that is kind of being eaten away at the back of my mind here. It just keeps surfacing and I'm trying to ignore it, but it's something that Brian had said about, and we've all seen a gajillion times, standing there with the tack vest on, hands in, all chillax, trying to be, Fonzie in the moment. And I think that is really what's going on, is some people have to rely on the badge to make their point, whereas some people can own the badge and just chillax and own the freaking grid square just as they stand there with their energy, with their attitude, with their abilities. And so there's a way to stand and own the space. And there's a way to stand because you don't know how to own the space. And so this has been populated or is being passed around to people who have yet to figure out how to stand there, be cool, and own the grid square in a way that is legit. And becoming legit takes time. And so to manage the moment, if you haven't figured how to be legit yet, you've got to have all your little hacks. You've got to have your little flares. You've got to have your badges. You've got to have your thing to demonstrate who you are, that you are someone who's here to take care of business. And if you don't know how to take care of business, then it's pretending that you're confident. It's pretending that you've got all the game. It's pretending that you've been there and done that. And so if someone is legit, however they stand, they're going to take care of business. But if they've never, ever taken care of business, they're going to mimic what they believe is legit.
That's true. That's true. 100%. That attitude of I could care less kind of thing, or like you're saying, like, oh, I saw, a really squared away officer stand this certain way or whatever. Hey, I got to ask y'all this. I don't want to have to admit this bias I have. I don't like Bryan Adams, the musician. Like I have a flat, and it makes me feel bad. I bet he's probably the nicest dude in the world because over the years I've watched, interviews, and my wife likes some of his songs, so she gives me a really hard time about Bryan Adams. And he spells his name with a Y, So there's like a running joke. If she wants to text me a message and mess with me, she'll write BR with a real big capital Y, lowercase a. But I got a bias towards that guy. I don't even know why. I just got
It's okay.
Brian Adams.
I have bias towards him as well, so it's all good.
So, it's funny that you should raise that. And I mean, it's right out of the blue, so I love it. But how about this? So when I was a kid, growing up in Alberta, I was still in high school. I was about 16 years old. And Brian freaking Adams was coming to, and I lived in a tiny little mountain town called Grand Cache in the middle of Nowheresville. Brian Adams was come to do a concert in a hockey arena in a place called Grand Prairie, which was a few hours drive away. So we all loaded in my buddy's vehicle. He just got his driver's license. We bombed up to this hockey arena to watch frickin' Brian Adams open for Loverboy. And so,
oh my gosh,
right?
This is getting worse and
Bam.
worse.
And so, so Brian Adams is the opening act. And the crowd ain't big because the hockey arena ain't big because Brian Adams is a nobody and Loverboy is just coming onto the scene. This is like 1980 or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so Brian Adams gets on and he looks like, a 19-year-old, all the pimples on his face kid. Like his face was a wreck. I remember looking at him thinking like, wow, man, like he's like all of us with the blemishes.
Yeah, and so I do love that. Yeah.
I have this bias in my head that the moment that Brian Adams' name is dropped, bam, I'm straight back to that hockey arena, observing a kid kind of make his way in life with his opening act. And so my initial interaction, like all of our initial interactions, creates a bias, whether it's negative or positive, it doesn't matter. But as soon as I hear his name, I'm instantly transported back to that moment. Just like, why, Brian, do you not, I'm not going to say you don't like Brian Adams, but why, what is it about Brian Adams that not now, because your wife's hassling you, but initially, what was the first thing that kind of put you off about it?
Yeah. First of all, the most Canadian thing I've ever heard is Brian Adams is playing in a hockey arena.
Right.
So I don't know the answer. Like I can remember, I can remember as a kid, I think that maybe like that Robin Hood movie, that song was probably played way too much. It was just something about him. I was like, what is this? But as an adult, and looking at, like you said, to me, on the surface, t-shirt and jeans. He was never like over the top. He was probably very sincere in the music he made. I don't know.
Yeah,
I can't remember where they're from.
So, like, given the scene that you were coming up in, with ska and et cetera, and I mean, let's, well, I'm going to call it the way I see it. Mm-hmm. Ska has some soul to it, whereas Brian Adams was just putting out, I mean, it was like a Hallmark memory card of, just pop music, like almost candy nonsense. Way different than what I feel to be meaningful, like ska, or like it's got a little bit of edge, or it's got something that you can connect to. It's hard to connect to Sugar, which is what his music was. It was just like honey in your ear, whereas ska has got you thinking. It's got you like contemplating life. It's got you choose which side you're on, which has, in a sense, caused you to be biased. Hey, Brian Adams doesn't create bias in a weird way,
Are y'all biased towards Rush? Do you dig?
I love Rush. Don't even say anything bad about Rush right now. or you'll never be on this show again.
No.
He's gonna ride his bike to come get you if you talk bad about.
No, I knew I could probably write a list of bands I figured you dug, but like my cousin put me on Rush when I was younger, and I couldn't fully grasp or understand. Like I was not the best student when I was a kid. Later in college, I learned how to really read and study. But man, early on, my first experiences listening to Rush, I couldn't comprehend a lot of it. But man, Tom Sawyer, I'd be like, play that song again.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I got to hear that. Play some more Dio.
This brings up an interesting point here too, because we've been talking about bias in terms of very physical interactions with people and how we engage and so on and so forth. But this brings up a really neat point in the fact that biases take place across the board. Like your taste in music is going to be biased based on where you grow up, who you're involved in, so on. So like Bryan Adams, for me, when I was growing up, he was a star. He was the mega star. He was touring everywhere. His music was on the radio all the friggin' time. And my initial reaction to it was, like Sean said, it was just like, it feels like the same kind of song all over again. We have the same issue with like Nickelback. I actually quite enjoyed their music for a little while, but everyone's gonna hate on them, right? And then you're like, so
yeah, now they're like big again.
And they're big again. So it's funny that, you know, music as an example in terms of bias is a great way to kind of explore your own biases. When I grew up, my dad was he's a country music singer, and he used to practice in the house. These are some of my youngest memories before my parents divorced, was listening to the same friggin' songs over and over because he'd be practicing them all day long, right? And I hated country music for years. And then in my like 30s, I started listening to country music again, and I started really enjoying it. I'm from the country, right? So it felt right. But the biases get set early on when you have those initial experiences on basically on every experience that we have in life.
So I want to interrupt you.
Yeah,
let me interrupt you real quickly. When you talk about country music, I said the exact same thing. Like my wife and I were sitting around talking. It's probably like a year and a half ago, somewhere around there. Same thing. She grew up in like near Nashville, Tennessee. Country stars. I mean, she's got pictures with like country musicians, like just a lot of history in it. And I was like, yeah, I never really dug country. And people would say 90s country, like 1990s. That era of country is the best. I'm like, Like I might listen to Johnny Cash maybe, but I'm like, I'm not going to get into that. And one night we're sitting here rolling Yahtzee because that's what cool people do at like 10 o'clock until 2 in the morning. We're rolling Yahtzee and playing music. And she starts playing, you know, it's her turn to play music. She's playing some 90s country. And man, it was like a switch went off. I'm like, oh, I know this song. I know this one. And I had been stationed at Fort Campbell, like just 45 minutes from Nashville, Tennessee. So I would go to Nashville all the time. And there was this country music playing in bars, in the barracks, like everybody was in the country. And so when I started hearing these songs, I was like, damn, like I am a 90s fan. Like I actually remember these songs and I do like them. And I mean, to the point where we'll listen to stuff now and I'm like, I got to hear Brooks and Dunn. Like put on some Neon Moon, Brooks and Dunn. Y'all can all kiss my, you know what? Like I want to hear some 90s country.
Oh man, I love this. This is we've gone down some interesting roads. That's for sure.
That's what we do in this conversation.
That's the whole point.
In the South, that's what we do. We sit around and talk for hours and hours and hours about who knows what. I don't know.
Well, we do that up north here too, and a lot of times it's based because we're stuck in the house because it's snowing.
Yeah.
Good deal.
You know, so if we're going to talk about the impact of music, which is a proxy for discussing biases, you know, we're all a result of how we were raised or the society around us, the culture that we engaged in when we were kids, et cetera. Brian, you know, skateboarding and yada, yada. So it's almost like a self-reinforcing bias that you are either aware of or not. But, you know, you become aware of that once you walk your skateboard into the barracks room and you hear your first country and western song and you're like, what the hell is this? And so then what? Then there's the reckoning. You know, if you've been listening to Rush all your life and then someone starts playing some African drum music, then what? Like, this is what we're all supposed to consider, the then what. And for me, like, I like to consider the world broadly and deeply. And so to be broad, it means that you've got to listen to classical, you got to listen to rock, you got to listen to country, you got to listen to it all. And not just revisit it once or twice or 12 times, like you got to keep going back and never stop going back. The time 10 years ago that you didn't like classical, well, you don't know if you like classical right now, unless you've revisited it. And you might not like it today, but you might like it 4 years from now. And so all of life is not a one and done, I feel. Through the phases of our life, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, each time we get an opportunity to revisit who we are in this phase of our life. And I think most people would be surprised that what they think they like is perhaps just a small slice of what they actually do like.
That's a great point. And on top of that, how many people go through their lives stuck in that in a consistent, I only like X or I only like Y, whether it be music, whether it be food, whether it be the people you hang out with, whatever. I think, like, I know I could probably list off the top of my head at least 10 different people that have not changed since they were 20. And actually, there's been people that I've had to just stop kind of hanging out with because they still haven't changed since they were 20. And every conversation we've had was, oh, you remember that time when we were, 21 and we were doing the things and blah. And I'm like, that's great, dude. I got other things to do right now. But we can get stuck in that routine, in that same rote history of our own making. And I'm going to say this as well, as I'm guilty of this for sure, because I spent a majority of my 30s doing this, just sitting in my head, constantly like, oh man, when I was a soldier, I used to do this. And man, when I was in the army, I used to blah. And now I'm realizing over time, especially with the collective and talking to people all over the place, is that how biased I was to the past rather than to the present. I think that's an interesting point. You got any thoughts?
Yeah, I would say like the same thing. Like that is a problem, and that I would probably say myself and my peers down here, like we do get caught in that. We get caught in what feels comfortable. We get caught in telling those stories, which I'm always going to tell the stories. Like we love it, but it's funny. Even like family functions, we tell the same stories and laugh just as hard, if not probably harder, because we're getting older. But no, it's true. I don't know. I like to think that I'm pretty adventurous, so I'll try new things, and my wife has helped me do that in the sense of what used to feel very safe for me was to go to certain locations, avoid crowds, blah, blah, blah. We've all kind of heard that stuff. And it's funny because I tell her all the time, like, I feel like when we're out in public, like there's just an at ease, like she just relaxes me. And it's cool to be able to feel that. And only once have I ever felt something that just kind of tingled when we were out downtown. And where we are is a beach town, but there's a little bit of nightlife, and we were walking down the street and I felt it, and it felt weird and I didn't like it. And I was like, I feel like there's a threat of some sort around me, and I can't even articulate it. And we talked later about it because it made me feel weird, and I probably acted very weird. But I will say that, there are things that we want to do travel-wise that I probably never would have done, that she says, hey, you could be cool. Like, let's go places. Let's go visit. Let's just go do whatever we want to do. And so we do it. We do it a lot, And so that's good. I live a very free life in that sense, and I don't feel like I'm in a certain lane or that I have to do something based on whoever I am, whatever bracket society puts me in, or previous employment I've had, or being from the South. Oh, you got to act a certain way or whatever. Basically, the only thing you got to do is you got to be nice and kind to people. That's the one thing I'll say. Other than that,
welcome to Canada, man. You got to be nice and kind.
No, you guys are like the nicest. You are the nicest dudes in the world, man. I used to feel bad about even making a joke sometimes on the show because I didn't want to mess up anything. But I like to cut a fool sometimes. So
it's all good. You mentioned being from the South, and I thought it was kind of funny. I was listening to a podcast, and it had a professor from the University of Alabama, and he was talking about like physics, and he had the really deep Southern accent, and it was very hard to just even believe that he knew what he was talking about just based on the fact that he had an accent. But he was a professor of physics at the University of Alabama. Like, it was crazy.
Yeah. the best.
Now we're almost at 2 hours here, so I just wanted to say thanks, man. I really appreciate the conversation, and to Chris as well. He had to jump out a little bit earlier. We didn't get a chance to give him a little bit of a closer, but really appreciate the conversation. It has been awesome. Let's get some final thoughts. Anything at all on bias or anything else we've talked about, because we've kind of hit the gambit. Brian, what do you got?
I enjoyed it, man. I feel better now that I can joke and cut up a little bit. I kind of got it out of my system, but yeah, just anybody listening, yeah, be aware of whatever bias that you have, but it doesn't mean that it's negative or bad. Like we said earlier, just be aware of it. And if there's certain groups or certain things that you think about people, it could be good or bad, I guess. I think we kind of harped on that earlier.
I like it. Sean, you got any final thoughts?
I do. So, bias. We can spend all day in our own little heads thinking that we're thinking about our biases and how we're going to sort those out, how we're going to be a better human being, because we're just studying ourselves all day long in the silence of our living rooms and becoming a better person. That can happen for sure. But I think another way, a better way, is to go out and just hang out with cool people. Just go out and see parts of the cool world that perhaps you haven't seen. As an example, in about a week and a half, I'm going to be heading down to California to see my buddy for about a week. Going to be down around maybe Huntington Beach area or something like that, like we were last year. And, we'll meet all kinds of characters while we're down there. We'll bump into all sorts of unusual situations for a Canadian. And that's important. It's important that everyone gets out of their comfort zone on a fairly regular basis, because what we think we know can only be pressure tested against the things we don't know. And that is on you to go find the things that you don't know by creating novel circumstances, novel experiences, novel people to reconfigure your biases.
That's a great point. I want to expand on that as my final thought here, in the fact that when we talk about the comfort zone, I think a lot of people's bias is towards comfort, specifically, like sitting on the couch or hanging out with your friends or whatever it is. But your comfort zone can be the hard stuff. It can be work. It can be, the friend group that you're with that challenges you, things like that. Whereas stepping out of the comfort zone might be being still, might be hanging out by yourself in the quiet, to Sean's point, right? Like, it's just about getting outside of what you know and experiencing life. So I think really in all aspects of things, music, engagement, experience, go out and challenge your bias. See what the world is like. I really appreciate the conversation, boys. It has been a pleasure. So as we all continue to learn, build, and grow, we'll see you next week.
Chimo.
Thanks everybody for watching and being part of the collective. If this has sparked any thoughts or resonated with you, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us grow and keeps the conversation going. We'll see y'all next time.